My mom offered me money to forgive my brother for getting my fiancée pregnant 2 months before. 3 years ago, I was engaged to a woman. I'll call her Lila. At the time, I truly believed she would be the person I'd marry. Lila and I had been together for almost 5 years, and our relationship seemed solid. We were both lawyers, which meant we led demanding and fast-paced lives. But we always found free time. The year I proposed to Lila was supposed to be the happiest year of our lives. But that same year, something unexpected happened. She lost her job. The loss came after it was discovered she had violated some company rules. I won't go into specific details because it's personal, but I will say the company fired her rather unceremoniously after what she did. If you've ever met a workaholic, a perfectionist, you might understand how such a loss can shake the foundations to their very core. The job wasn't just a job for Lila. It was part of her identity, her pride, and her purpose. Losing it so abruptly left her devastated. Lila immediately threw herself into job hunting, applying to countless firms and corporations. Unfortunately, her experience was highly specialized, and opportunities weren't exactly easy to come by, especially after the circumstances of her dismissal. Months went by, and she still hadn't landed a new position. Throughout all of this, I tried to be as supportive as possible. I assured her she didn't need to worry about finances. We were engaged, after all, and I saw it as my responsibility to take care of her during this difficult time. Knowing Lila had a tendency to obsess over things and stress excessively, I encouraged her to relax and not let the situation consume her. To my relief, she took my advice, or at least she tried. With her newfound free time, she decided to pursue something that had always been a dream of hers, learning landscaping. She enrolled in a local landscaping class and began dedicating her free hours to this new hobby. It also happened to be the same landscaping class my brother, Mason, was attending. Let me tell you a little about Mason. He's the complete opposite of me. While I was the responsible, introverted one growing up, focusing on my studies and career, Mason was the typical carefree guy. He spent his school days pulling pranks, earning a reputation as a womanizer. That reputation followed him to college and beyond. He was the type of person who never stayed with a girl for long and rarely took anything seriously. Lila had met Mason early in our relationship and knew the kind of person he was. So, when she started going to the same landscaping class as Mason, I thought their paths crossing there was just a coincidence. But, looking back, that's when things started to change. Over the course of a few weeks, the two of them became surprisingly close. At first, I didn't think much of it. Mason offered to pick her up and drop her off from class sometimes, which seemed thoughtful, albeit unusual. Lila would come home excited, telling me stories about what she and Mason had done in landscaping class, or showing me pictures of the things they'd been working on. But then, their interactions extended beyond landscaping. They started going out on weekends, doing things like visiting art museums or trying new restaurants. These were activities that Lila and I normally enjoyed together. But now she was doing them with Mason instead. Over time, there were many more changes in Lila's behavior. She was spending far more time with Mason than I was comfortable with, and this was starting to affect our relationship. She even started canceling our date nights to go out with him. I'm not the type to stay quiet, letting things fester. So, one night, I confronted her directly. I asked her point blank if there was something going on between her and Mason. Lila was taken aback by my question. She was even offended. She vehemently denied that anything inappropriate was happening and insisted that her time with Mason was purely platonic. She explained that spending time with him was fun and light, contrasting it with hanging out with a younger brother. She seemed genuinely hurt that I would even suggest otherwise. And for a moment, I felt guilty for doubting her. But deep down, her explanations didn't fully reassure me. Things came to a head just 2 months before our wedding. At that point, I was working tirelessly. I had an intense workload to make sure everything was in order financially. Since Lila lost her job, I had taken on all the financial responsibility for our household and all the wedding expenses. She hadn't found a new job yet, and while she was using some of her savings for personal needs or emergencies, I was carrying most of the weight. Between paying for everything and the stress of planning a wedding, my hours at the office had become longer and more grueling. I wasn't as present as I should have been, and looking back, maybe that gave Lila and Mason the opportunity to get as close as they did. One night, I arrived home early from a business trip. I wanted to surprise Lila and spend time with her. When I pulled into the driveway, I immediately noticed my brother's car parked outside. Normally, I wouldn't have thought much of it. Mason had a habit of showing up unannounced, but this time was different. It was past 9 p.m., and seeing his car there so late raised a red flag. The living room was empty, but the TV was on. My eyes immediately landed on the beer cans scattered on the floor, and then on something unmistakable, Lila's underwear carelessly strewn among them. I knew in that instant what I was about to discover. Part of me wanted to turn around and leave, but another part, the part that needed irrefutable proof, pushed me to go on. I needed to see it with my own eyes. I walked slowly and stopped at the doorway. There they were, Lila and Mason, entwined in the most intimate way imaginable. They were so engrossed in each other that they didn't even notice I was standing there. I'm normally a calm and collected person, but this was a betrayal of the highest order. Without saying a word, I entered the room, approached the bed, and grabbed Mason by the scruff of his neck. I pulled his face away from Lila, and the astonishment on his face was almost satisfying. He turned to look at me, and his expression instantly shifted from confusion to terror. I didn't even look at Lila. Mason immediately started stammering, apologizing to me. But his words meant nothing to me at that moment. I punched him straight in the nose. The crunch of bone gave me a grim satisfaction as blood started pouring down his face. He screamed in pain, but I wasn't finished. I punched him again and again. Each punch landed harder than the last. Blood dripped from his nose, staining his shirt, but I didn't care. He stumbled backward, his hands weakly trying to block me, but I kept going. When Mason was on the floor, bloodied and begging me to stop, I turned my attention to Lila. She was sitting on the bed, trembling and sobbing. I looked her directly in the eyes and told her she had 10 minutes to get out of my house. If she didn't, I warned her I wouldn't hesitate to leave her in the same bloody state as my brother. She started begging me, apologizing over and over. She said she could explain and pleaded with me not to throw her out, to give her a chance to fix things. But I wasn't interested in her excuses or apologies. I looked at my watch and said coldly, "You have 9 minutes left." The tone of my voice and the look in my eyes must have told her I wasn't kidding, because she scrambled out of bed and started getting dressed with trembling hands. Tears streamed down her face as she grabbed a suitcase from the closet and started packing what she could. When she was done, dragging her half-packed suitcase down the stairs, she turned to me one last time. Her voice was broken as she begged me to listen to her, claiming she loved me and deserved a chance to explain herself. Without saying a word, I took her engagement ring from her finger and pushed her toward the door. She tried to resist, begging me to reconsider, but I was done. I opened the door and shoved her out into the night. On the porch, still crying and shouting for forgiveness. I didn't even look back as I slammed the door in her face. Mason's face was still bloodied after our fight, and although I was still boiling with rage, I didn't want to be responsible for anything worse that might happen to him. I called my parents and told them everything that had happened. My dad was furious with Mason, and my mom was in shock, but they both said they'd come immediately. When they arrived, my mom, being a nurse, took care of Mason's wounds. She cleaned and bandaged his injuries, which, thankfully, were mostly superficial. Meanwhile, my dad took me to the backyard, away from Mason. I could see that my hands were still shaking with rage, and I was barely controlling myself. A little later, Mason came out to the patio with my mom. His face was bruised, his nose bandaged, and there were still traces of blood on his shirt. He apologized for betraying me, claiming he never intended for things to happen this way. But then he dropped the bomb. He said he was in love with Lila. I finally turned to look at him, furious. He continued explaining how he believed Lila felt the same way about him. He assured me that that had been the first time they'd slept together, as if that somehow made things better. Then he pulled out his phone and showed me their messages, conversations full of flirtatious texts, secrets, and confessions from Lila about how unhappy she was in our relationship. According to Mason, she was the one who invited him to stay that night, thinking I'd still be away on a business trip. As I read those messages, my rage boiled over again. Mason kept talking, telling me he was sorry for betraying me, but he also insisted he'd never felt this way about anyone before. He said he couldn't stop himself and begged me to forgive him. My dad, who had been listening silently, finally had enough. He told Mason he was lucky if he didn't do to him what I did to his house. But my mom's reaction was different. Mason had always been her favorite, and I could see how she was struggling with the situation. My mom started telling me that, regardless of what I decided to do regarding Lila, I needed to forgive my brother. She said he seemed genuinely remorseful, and two brothers shouldn't be at odds over a woman. She even went so far as to offer me money to compensate for the wedding expenses. But when I told her I was willing to accept her check but not to forgive, she withdrew her offer. I interrupted her and told my parents I wasn't in the mood for sermons or advice. The only thing I wanted at that moment was for them to take Mason and leave. I couldn't stand to see him anymore. My dad nodded, understanding that I needed space, and helped Mason into the car. My mom hesitated, clearly wanting to stay and mediate, but finally followed him. In the weeks that followed, I was still dealing with the aftermath. Lila had been messaging me persistently, begging for forgiveness and trying to explain herself. But her explanations always revolved around the same tired excuses, which were quite similar to what Mason had already told me. She claimed she and Mason never intended to hurt me. I basically ignored the messages all week. Then, out of the blue, I received a phone call from Mason. He informed me that he and Lila had just found out she was pregnant, and the baby was his. He told me that, since she was carrying his child, he wanted to marry her and wanted my blessing, which he didn't get. My mother's reaction only made everything worse. She had already been trying to act as a mediator between Mason and me, but now she seemed to view Lila's pregnancy as some kind of divine intervention. She told me it was God's plan that Lila got pregnant this way, and that maybe Mason and Lila were always meant to be together. It was as if she was trying to justify the unjustifiable, to excuse what they had done because it fit into her new fantasy of becoming a grandmother. I told my mother at that point that I knew exactly what she was doing, and that if she decided to side with Mason and Lila, our relationship would be over. I wasn't kidding. My brother's betrayal was already enough, but having my own mother defending him was something I couldn't accept. My father tried to remain neutral, perhaps thinking that would help to de-escalate the tension. Anyway, my mother offered Lila financial support, assuring her that she and the baby would be well cared for. But of course, there was a condition. My mother insisted that she and Mason had to get married. After all, that's what Mason also wanted. Mom was relentless in her pursuit of this outcome. refusing to even consider the idea of her grandchild being born out of wedlock. When I found out that Mason and Lila were actually going to get married and had started sending wedding invitations to our relatives, I felt furious and humiliated. Without further discussion, I simply kept my word and cut my mother and brother out of my life. However, my mother doesn't give up easily. For weeks after the breakup, she called me incessantly, left voicemails, and even showed up at my door uninvited, trying to guilt me into reconciling. It was suffocating. That's when I knew the only way to escape her was to leave the city altogether. It's been 3 years since they destroyed my life, and I moved to a new city, cutting ties with almost everyone in my family except for my father. He respected my decision to move and understood why I needed the distance, although he was saddened that I no longer visited them. In these 3 years, I rebuilt my life piece by piece. I didn't share my new number with anyone except my dad. I made new friends. I found a sense of normalcy again and worked hard to put the past behind me. So imagine my surprise when, yesterday, I found Lila at my door ringing the doorbell. When I opened the door, I almost didn't recognize her at first. Lila looked nothing like the woman I once loved. She looked as if she were ill or had suffered greatly. During this time, she was there, clutching the hand of a little girl who couldn't have been more than 2 or 3 years old. The little girl had Mason's sharp features, leaving no room for doubt that he was the father. I wondered why she was here, how she found me, what she wanted. Finally, I broke the silence. Lila, what are you doing here? She was crying as she asked me if she could come in, saying she had something important to discuss with me. My first instinct was to say no, send them away. But then I looked at the little girl next to her, looking at me with those innocent, wide eyes. I couldn't be rude in front of the child, so I stepped aside and gestured for them to come in. I showed them to the sofa and offered them water. Once they were settled, I sat opposite them and asked, "What are you doing here?" I already knew she wouldn't have found me on her own. I hadn't given my address to anyone except my dad, and I trusted him to keep it confidential, unless something truly important came up. So, what was so important as to make him give her my location? Instead of answering immediately, Lila reached into her purse and pulled out an envelope. She handed it to me without saying a word. I opened it immediately. I recognized my mother's handwriting. My mother had written, bluntly, that it was my responsibility to fix the mess Mason had created. She explained how Lila and Jesse were struggling, how Mason had abandoned them, and how, as Mason's brother and Jesse's uncle, I should help them because Lila was the woman who was almost going to be my wife, and the girl was my niece. I looked at Lila, confused and angry. What is this supposed to mean? I asked. That's when Lila broke down and started telling me the whole story. According to her, Mason had always been unfaithful in their relationship from the very beginning, even after Lila gave birth to their daughter, Jessie. My brother continued having affairs intermittently throughout the time they were together. For her part, Lila had tried to make things work, hoping things would improve over time, if only for Jessie's sake. But 3 months ago, Mason abruptly packed his things and left without explanation, without a note, without warning. He simply disappeared. Since then, Lila had been alone. She had no job, no savings, no home. She and Mason had been living in a rented house, and without him, she couldn't afford to stay. My mom, feeling some kind of obligation towards Jessie, had been giving Lila money to support them. But now, with Mason essentially gone for good, my mom had decided she no longer wanted to be responsible for Lila and her daughter. Lila continued, telling me that my mother wanted me to take care of her and Jessie since they had nowhere to go and no one else to turn to. I felt utterly disgusted by what she was asking and how ridiculous it was that both she and my mother expected me to help. My mother not only sided with Mason during the initial betrayal, but was now trying to foist the consequences of his actions onto me. My mother's relentless favoritism towards Mason was back as usual. I immediately told Lila, quite directly and in front of her daughter, that she had no right to expect any help from me. This wasn't my daughter. She was no longer my fiancée, and this clearly wasn't my responsibility. Although I felt bad that Mason had simply abandoned her, she should have seen it coming. After all, he's not the most reliable or responsible person. I wasn't going to let myself be manipulated into helping, so I asked Lila to leave. She started crying, saying she had nowhere to go and no money, and what little she had left she'd spent on gas to come see me. I ended up giving her enough to fill her tank before asking her to leave. So that's my story with my mother and her favoritism. I recently discovered this subreddit about parents who favor one child, and I thought it would be interesting to share my story. I want to clarify a few things. My mom's behavior in this situation is also completely baffling to me. The fact that she's trying to guilt me into helping Lila and her daughter after everything that's happened seems incredibly selfish to me. I understand she may feel obligated because of her granddaughter, but she shouldn't expect me to clean up her golden boy's mess, especially after how everything turned out when I was the one who was betrayed. If my mother wants to have a favorite child, then she can have one, but she should also take responsibility for him. I agree with some of the comments that my dad also betrayed me. Instead of offering me the support I needed after everything that happened, he took a neutral stance. Although he did scold my brother that time, he never really fully sided with me by not challenging my mother's manipulative behavior. He also played a part in this betrayal. I plan on having a conversation with him soon. It's true that Mason left Lila, but that doesn't automatically place the responsibility on me to take care of her. She made her choices, and while I can feel some sympathy for her given the circumstances, I owe her nothing. The fact that she showed up at my door with nothing but a sad story and a child only highlights her desperation. I didn't reject her out of spite. I simply made it clear that it's not my job to fix what Mason broke. I'm not obligated to take care of her just because she's now in a difficult situation. That child is definitely not mine. Lila and I had already broken up weeks before she got pregnant, and by the time we ended things, we had long since stopped being intimate. The timeline is clear, and there's absolutely no possibility that I'm the father, so there's no need for a test or anything. Besides, Jesse has all of Mason's features, his face, his eyes, his smile. It's like looking at him as a child. I have no doubt that Mason is her father. I don't need to get a paternity test because the resemblance is unmistakable. The girl is undoubtedly Mason's daughter, and I'm not going to get dragged into more confusion. I don't want to adopt my niece. I can't believe some of you are even suggesting this. Regardless of Lila's financial or emotional situation, she is the mother, and it's her responsibility. I don't understand why she never worked after getting married or why she didn't save. He is the father. So even if they separate, both Lila and Mason must take responsibility for taking care of their daughter. Mason has no choice but to pay child support. I spoke to my parents about everything. I already knew my dad had given Lila my address, but I wanted to hear it directly from him. I called him and asked him point blank why he agreed to share my location with her after I had repeatedly asked him not to, and what he expected me to do for Lila and her daughter after all these years. My dad was silent for a moment, clearly uncomfortable. Then he sighed deeply and apologized. "I'm sorry, son. I'm truly sorry," he said. "We did everything we could to help Lila, but with Mason gone for so long, we could only do so much. Your mom begged me to give her your address. She said that maybe, if you saw her after all this time, you'd want to help her somehow, since she has nowhere to go." I felt my frustration rising and asked him, "Why would you think I'd want to help someone like her? She betrayed me with Mason, hurt me, and now you want me to help her?" My dad told me he understood why I was angry. He explained that neither he nor my mom wanted things to end this way, but that Lila and Jesse were also family to them now. He believed I was their only option. He apologized to me again, but I didn't listen. I told him that he and I were done. I had trusted him to be different from my mom, but it turned out they were all the same, backstabbing traitors. Did they really think that I would somehow forget the past, accept Lila and my brother's daughter into my life, and start taking care of them? Wow, it's a harsh blow to realize that my parents didn't really care about me. I told my dad firmly and without hesitation to lose my number and forget I ever existed for him. Since he knew my address, I warned him that if he or my mom showed up at my house, I'd call the police. My dad tried to apologize again, begging me to listen, but I wasn't interested anymore. "Don't call me again," I said simply. "Don't do it. You made your choices, and I'm making mine." If he was hoping I'd let him say one last thing, I'm sorry for him. I hung up the phone and immediately blocked his number. What my dad has done is unforgivable, and there's no going back. It's been almost a month since my last update. I finally managed to locate Mason with the help of one of my friends. It turns out Lila was right. Mason has been living with his latest conquest in a nearby town, pretending he has no responsibilities, as if he has no family. It doesn't surprise me. That's how he's been his whole life. I can't believe this is the same guy who told me with a serious face that he was in love with Lila 3 years ago. The same guy who turned my life upside down. And now, after all that, when he got bored with Lila and his daughter, was living with someone else? Lila knew. She knew what my brother was like. And still, she decided to cheat on me with him. So I don't feel sorry for her. It's like being told something is hot and still deciding to touch it. You're going to get burned. After finding out where he was, I sent the address to Lila. I didn't want to get involved in any more of her drama, but I also didn't want to abandon a child who was innocent of the pair of idiots that were her parents. So I gave her one last piece of advice. You need to hire a lawyer and file for divorce and child support. Do it now, before Mason disappears somewhere else. Lila thanked me for everything, and I could hear the relief in her voice. She apologized again, as she had done so many times before, but I wasn't interested in hearing her anymore. I'm done. I texted her. Don't contact me again. Don't show up at my door. This is the last thing I'm doing for you. What we had, whatever it was, ended a long time ago. I just wanted you to stop disturbing my peace. Forever. Update 4. To tell you about this update, I have to give you some context about my brother. My brother never really finished college, and since he left, he's been living off odd jobs. Mostly. That's why he was taking a landscaping class, as he wanted to get a job in that field. But that type of job he usually gets allows him to not be tied to any one place. And if you've read my previous posts, you'll know where I'm going with this. Yes, my brother has moved, although fled is a better word for it. Apparently, he knew Lila would be looking for him to sue him for child support, and the first thing he did was run away from his ex-girlfriend's house. That's what Lila found out when she went to that girlfriend's house to talk to him. But he was already gone. His girlfriend told her he'd moved, and she doesn't know where he is. But whether that's true or just a lie, nobody can know for sure now. Meanwhile, I found out about all this because Lila emailed me about it, all to ask me to help her find him again. But I told her she betrayed me again by not following my request to not contact me anymore, so I wouldn't help her with anything. My father also betrayed me when he apologized on behalf of my mother when they showed up at my house. I won't bore you by telling you why they came because you already know. But I told them to their faces that I wasn't going to use any more of my money on that woman. I'd already wasted so much on a wedding that didn't happen, and they seemed fine with that. So my mother said she could give me back some of the money if I took care of Lila and my niece. I replied that if she was willing to write a check right then, maybe, just maybe, I would take the time to think if it was a good idea to waste my time deciding whether or not to accept Lila back, which translates to it's highly likely that I wouldn't. But she told me she needed the assurance that if she wrote a check, she'd get results. I told her it would be a gamble on her part. She thought it over for a bit and wrote me a check for $5,000. That doesn't cover even a quarter of the wedding, but it's something. Then I told them to leave because the check didn't include not calling the police if they showed up at my house. So they left pretty quickly. I was thinking for a few seconds if I should use my time thinking about whether or not to accept Lila back. And after long seconds of very deep thought, I came to the conclusion that no. I think I spent more time depositing the check than deciding. The good thing is that the check had funds. I let my mother know over the phone, which she didn't take very well because, according to her, if I had taken her money, I should at least have kept my promise. But even if I had signed a contract, the check was just to consider it. And what's even worse, to think if it was a good idea to consider it. And I've already thought about it more than necessary for a topic I don't care about. Maybe if the check had been bigger, I would have considered it for a few more seconds. But the decision would have been the same. That idea of my mother to mess with a betrayed lawyer. My mother has asked me to return the money, but I've told her to sue me if she thinks she has a legal basis for doing so. There isn't even a text message. And if she recorded our conversation when I called to tell her no. There's also no mention that I would accept Lila back for money. It would be an interesting case in court. Besides the possibility of a countersuit on my part, my brother has surfaced, and Lila has finally served him with the papers. And guess who my brother wants to represent him? Good luck getting someone to do the work for free, because I won't, and he doesn't have the money. And good luck to Lila trying to get anything from my brother. If she wanted financial security, at least she shouldn't have picked a loser.